Kemba Walker wants to be traded. The Celtics want to move him, but does anybody else want him? What's up, fellas? My name is Tucker. Let's go ahead and talk about it. A report came out recently saying that Kemba Walker and the Boston Celtics are headed towards a, quote, breakup where Kemba nor the Celtics want Kemba to return to Boston next year. So we're going to talk about that situation first, and then we'll get to some fake trades. This situation is a really interesting one. Everybody knows that Boston was shopping Kemba Walker before the season last year. What's mentioned most specifically in this article was a possible Drew Holiday trade. Boston knew that they probably needed to upgrade this spot if they wanted to get to where they wanted to be, and a lot of that largely centered around the injury issues that Kemba was dealing with in that offseason and that he had been dealing with the entirety of his time in Boston to that point. At the time that Boston signed Kemba Walker to the big free agency deal, Kyrie leaves, Al Horford leaves, Charlotte doesn't really want to pay Kemba max money, the Celtics step up, they sign Kemba. Pretty much everybody knew that Kemba had some knee injury issues and that was going to be a problem for him on the contract that he signed. It's one of the reasons why Charlotte was hesitant to bring him back, and ultimately it's one of the reasons why he has not been as successful in Boston as many people had hoped. And so now Kemba's not only frustrated with the team for shopping him, but Boston probably wants to move on from him as well, as they showed last offseason by shopping him around for, as I mentioned, players like Drew Holiday. The problem is, I'm not sure anybody is all that excited about trading for Kemba Walker right now. One, because of the injury and the performance issues where he is just not the same kind of player as the guy that was making all-star teams and a few all-NBA teams in Charlotte, but also the contract. His contract pays him over $35 million next year, and then once again as well on a player option for the following season as well. And given his performances and his injury issues, that's going to be a difficult contract to move. Kemba Walker is just not the same caliber of player. So it makes sense that Boston wants to move on from him, but I'm not really sure that there are going to be a lot of teams that are going to be excited about bringing in Kemba Walker because yes, it's a big name, but he's just not the same kind of player that he used to be. Having said that, I'm not going to go through the whole video and not give you guys some fake trades, right? So we'll go through a handful of scenarios in which I could see Kemba Walker possibly being moved. There are teams around the league that could be looking for a perimeter scoring guard that could bank on Kemba's injury issues resolving themselves and probably giving up either a troubled asset, another guy that deals with injury issues, or getting some extra assets from Boston in exchange just for taking on Kemba's contract. The first one is the one that gets talked about the most, I feel like, and it's a Kristaps Porzingis for Kemba Walker swap. Now, in this scenario, it's literally just those two players being swapped, but if you want to add assets on either side, that's fine. It's difficult to kind of figure out where the assets should go. It's a very subjective thing, but let's talk about the trade as a whole. So Kemba goes to Dallas. Dallas tried to sign Kemba Walker in free agency a few years ago. In addition to trying to sign someone like Chris Middleton, they know that they need help on the perimeter. They need another creator alongside Luka, and that was very, very apparent in the playoffs. It was also very apparent that Kristaps Porzingis is just not a great fit there in Dallas. They're going to ask him to just spot up. He's not going to be great at that. His individual scoring skills just have not really developed the way that they would have hoped, and it's just not a good fit. And he's another guy that is unhappy. So it's a logical thing to get to where you trade two players that are unhappy and each of them fit pretty well in what would be their new situations. Porzingis goes into the front court there in Boston. He's a full-time five. He spaces the floor for Brown and Tatum. He gets more individual scoring opportunities. And Boston, ever since Al Horford left, has been trying to find a way to fill that void at the five spot. And when you swap out Kemba for Porzingis, and then you've got Marcus Smart, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, Kristaps Porzingis, and whoever else you want to be the fifth guy with a possible Marcus Smart trade still looming here, I think that deal makes a lot of sense for Boston. They get younger. They get out of the Kemba contract. Porzingis' contract does run for another year, and he has his own injury and performance issues. But I personally would rather have Porzingis than I would Kemba just because of the age stuff and the fact that I feel like there's something you could possibly tap into there in Porzingis. Just if he can get to a situation in which he's happier. I don't know if that situation would develop in Boston because Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum are certainly still going to see a ton of the basketball, so it's not like KP is going to be the number one guy, but maybe it makes sense to get both of these guys in a new situation, in a new environment. For Dallas, as I talked about briefly, them getting another perimeter creator is critical to their offseason, and Porzingis is a guy that they're probably going to look to trade. They look to trade him during the season. They know the contract issues with him. And the thing with Kemba is his deal is 1 year less than Porzingis, and he fits really well on this roster. Now, ultimately, would Boston have to give up an extra pick in order to get KP and get out of the Kemba deal, or would just the fact that I feel like KP's value is a little bit higher because he's younger, but Kemba's contract runs out a year earlier. Do those two things cancel out and you can just swap these two players? I'm not sure, but this is one that people are certainly going to keep an eye on. The next couple of trades, though, are basically just Boston dumping Kemba for salary reasons to get out from the contract and to try and open up some cap space for themselves moving forward. And this next one is one that's going to get thrown around a ton because we know the Oklahoma City Thunder love to trade for big contracts if you're giving them a first-round pick in exchange, and that's exactly what's happening here. Al Horford returns to Boston. We'll talk about that in a second, in exchange for Kemba Walker and a top 10 protected first-round pick in this 2021 draft, which, of course, would be outside of the top 10, but you can still put that top 10 protection on a future pick if you'd like to. So Kemba in Oklahoma City is kind of irrelevant. They're just taking on the contract. They're getting the first round pick, and they're hoping that just like they're doing here with Horford, a year from now, they can flip that big expiring for someone else. They just continue to roll over, continue to get first round pick after first round pick. We know that Oklahoma City is playing the long game here, and if you're going to give them a first round pick to take on Kemba Walker and you're going to take back Al Horford, they're probably going to do that 100 out of 100 times, and they'll figure out what to do with Kemba once he gets there. For Boston, you're getting out of the Kemba contract, which opens up some space for you moving forward. And the Horford thing is interesting because obviously they didn't want to sign him to the contract that he's currently on because he ended up leaving to go sign it with Philadelphia a few years ago. But he helps you with the 5 spot. He's someone that I think can still be productive, can still be a veteran presence for you. And even though his contract runs for this upcoming season as well as the following, it's partially guaranteed for that following season at $14.5 million. So my understanding of that, and that's the number that I'm seeing, is essentially Boston could buy out Al Horford of his contract, not this upcoming season, but the following, and save themselves a ton of money on that 14.5 compared to the 37 that Kemba would be making in that season, assuming, of course, that he would pick up that player option. So this is strictly a money-saving move for Boston and allows them to be a little bit more flexible moving forward in their team building. And Horford, I think, is still a player that can help you. Obviously, nobody wants to pay Al Horford $28 million a year at this point in his career, but if you're already paying Kemba 34, you give up the pick, you change around your roster a little bit, you get rid of the Kemba contract, and Al Horford is there to really help you out. I don't know how likely that is. I don't know how ugly it was when Horford left Boston the first time, but just strictly from a schematic and from a salary cap standpoint, this trade makes a lot of sense. Granted, Boston's team doesn't really get better here, but they open up some flexibility for themselves moving forward. Next up, the Chicago Bulls, a Kemba destination that is certainly not really being talked about a ton right now. But as we go into this offseason, this is a trade they could possibly look to make. Again, it doesn't really help Boston at all with their season this upcoming year, but it does help them moving forward with their flexibility. So they get Thaddeus Young and Al-Farouq Aminu. Just think of those two guys as expiring contracts. Thaddeus Young can still help them a little bit in the front court, but his contract will run out after this upcoming season, as will Al-Farouq Aminu's, and then you've basically gotten out of the Kemba deal an entire year earlier than you would have if you kept him on the roster. Opens up $37 million for you on your payroll, which is huge for the summer of 2022. Chicago is in a really, really interesting scenario here. They have given up their pick for this year and in 2023, assuming that it does not get protected by landing in the top 4 for this season, because they went out and they got Vucevic. They've got Zach LaVine. They've got Patrick Williams, but they need more star power if they really want to make the playoffs next year. And Kemba Walker, when healthy, could be a really good fit. He's an on and an off ball player. He can play alongside Zach LaVine. He can play alongside Vucevic. He can play alongside Patrick Williams. And even though defensively, him and LaVine in the backcourt would not be a very good fit at all, offensively, assuming Kemba's healthy, that would be a really, really interesting fit. And Chicago needs to be good next year. I don't think people are talking enough about the possibility of Zach LaVine's free agency here coming up, where he's going to get a ton of money. Someone's going to pay Zach LaVine a ton. And Chicago is in a scenario where he could possibly be leaving if they don't have a good season this year. So you go out, you get Kemba, he plays alongside LaVine, you make the playoffs, you re-sign LaVine, and then you're going to just move forward with that. This kind of, to me, resembles like the Mike Conley trade a couple of years ago for Utah, where they know they need another guy in the backcourt. They've got a talented two in Donovan Mitchell, and in this case, it's Zach LaVine. And you know that Mike Conley's making too much money. You know Kemba's making too much money, but if they can get healthy, they can really help your team. And for Boston, You're getting out of the Kemba money, and you don't have to give up an extra asset to do so. You're probably not that excited about Al-Farouq Aminu and Thaddeus Young, but you open up a ton of salary cap space, and these are what Kemba trades are going to look like, in my opinion, if Boston is really that committed to getting rid of him. They're not getting a ton of value in exchange for Kemba Walker. The best they can hope for is either Porzingis trade or something like this to Chicago, or our next trade that I'll show you in a second, where you're getting rid of Kemba without having to give up anything extra, really. The last trade, the New York Knicks. Kemba has talked in the past about how it would be really fun to play for the Knicks, and in this scenario, he goes to New York in exchange for Kevin Knox, and 2 second-round picks go with Kemba. So the Knicks are in an interesting scenario this offseason where they have cap space, but nobody to really spend it on. And so they could look at this scenario and say, okay, well, why don't we just sign Kemba Walker to a 2-year deal in free agency, essentially, by giving up basically nothing. It's Kevin Knox, taking Kemba Walker into their immense amount of salary cap space, doing Boston a favor by taking on this contract, getting 2 second-round picks out of it in addition, and Boston just wipes their hands of the Kemba thing, and they move forward and try and figure out something with this roster while opening up the flexibility in their payroll department that getting rid of Kemba would do. For New York, they get perimeter creation that they desperately need. Maybe they're taking too big of a step forward too quickly, getting a guy that's aging, taking up a lot of their salary cap space, and has had some injury issues. But if you just really want to carry forward the momentum that this team has had, this team has created this year, then a Kemba trade is not the worst idea in the world. But as you can see, and as we talked about in the beginning of this video, Kemba trades are going to be really difficult to come by in a way that improves Boston's roster in an immediate sense. That's the difficult situation they've put themselves in that this report really outlines, and that is that Kemba doesn't want to be there. Boston is going to shop him as they did last offseason, but ultimately, I don't know that there's a way that they move him that improves their roster in an immediate sense, which pushes them towards a scenario in which they're just trying to free up some payroll, which can create a weird vibe because you're basically admitting that you're making your team worse to save money, and that does not always sit very well with players. That might be the correct move in the long term for the team, for the organization, for the payroll sheet, but these are real people you're dealing with here, and so how they maneuver the Kemba Walker situation this offseason is certainly going to be something that I'm going to be keeping an eye on. Let me know down in the comment section below what you guys would do with Kemba and where you would potentially trade him if you were Boston. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like rating. Check out more videos from me, the boxes on screen, and consider subscribing to the channel as well. With all this thing said, hope you guys have an awesome rest of your day, and I will see you all next time.